If you love painting animals with oils but are fed up with your pet portraits looking too tight, I'm going to walk you through my most favorite tools to avoid the most common pet portrait hangups. My name is Chelsea, and if you're new here, I specialize in helping artists to master painting portraits in oil in a way that's expressive and painterly. So if you find this video helpful and you are finding the journey to looser paintings frustrating or painful, I'm here to help. Check out the link in the description to book a call to talk directly with me. Now, to kick off this video, I want to make sure that you're set up for success before the painting even starts. My biggest tip for creating painterly pet portraits that you're proud of is to start with a clear idea of what you want your end result to look like. Do you want a Jennifer Gennari style painting with loose brushwork and an abstracted background? Or maybe something that's highly stylized with lots of texture and impasto? Or what about an image with lots of detail and bold, larger than life color? I've said it before, but this is one instance where a picture really is worth 1,000 words. So to best answer this question and start visualizing exactly what you want your pet portraits to look like, start by putting together an inspiration board for your project. Or even better, have an inspiration board for what you want your work to look like generally. And then from there, you should have a great jumping off point for an individual pet portrait. If you want some help getting started with creating an inspiration board, I'd recommend checking out this video on what to do to find your oil painting voice. It walks you through the start to finish process of creating a digital inspiration board that you can refer to over and over. Then that can become the jumping off point for an inspiration board that's just for pet portraits. I have a board kind of like this already for equine paintings, and I sometimes take it even further by creating a board that's just for one painting in particular to show me exactly what I need to do to make sure that I enjoy that painting and I'm proud to show it off to a collector. Once you have a clear idea of what your final product is going to look like, your life is going to be so much easier if you make sure that you're working off of a strong reference. When possible, this means taking pictures yourself. But if you're doing something like a memorial pet portrait and it's just not possible to take additional reference photos, ask your client for as many photos as possible for you to choose from. And when you're making that final selection, make sure you avoid distortion that comes from the animal's face, usually their nose, being way too close to the camera lens compared to their body, as this tends to look okay in a photo, but kind of wonky and confusing in a painting. Look for a reference that's well lit. In general, having clear light and shadow in the portrait makes it much easier to tackle. Building on that, outdoor pictures can take this even further because the light tends to bring out even more color in your subject than it happens to indoors. These two steps, a clear vision for the final product and a really solid reference, these represent the 20% of effort that gets you 80% of the results. Because working off of a bad reference toward an unclear vision for the final painting is an incredibly steep uphill battle. But what if your painting skills aren't where you want them to be? If this is how you're feeling, I want to remind you of one thing first. If someone commissioned you to paint their pet, they're probably pretty darn familiar with your work already. They know your style. They love it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked to spend their money with you. They probably aren't hoping that somehow you'll miraculously transform your style overnight just for them. They probably want you to paint the way that you've always painted. That being said, I know commission clients will sometimes just find an artist that they happen to know and ask for that artist to paint a portrait in another artist's style. I think every painter I know has had some version of this experience at one point or another. And the truth is, this is usually a tough but helpful learning experience. Not that I recommend it, but eventually the experience will be over and you'll move on and you'll be all the wiser for next time. It's an experience that teaches you that this is a red flag, and if a potential client doesn't seem familiar with your work, you should probably make it really clear that their painting is going to come out looking like pet portraits that are already in your portfolio by and large. If they don't like that work or they still want someone else's style, you both would be better off if you refer that client to a different artist. With that being said, what if you really do want to be able to paint differently than you've been painting for this pet portrait? I like to warm up with a master study to tackle this. I take my inspiration board, I find a painting that has the color or the lighting or the brushwork that I want to work toward in my own original piece, and I set out to study it and emulate it. I try to put myself in that artist's shoes as much as possible. I think through how the paint must have been applied, and I try my best to really capture what I loved most about that painting. Doing that warm-up effectively puts that way of painting into my own muscle memory. Whether it's some tidbit about my color and how to control the palette, or how to manipulate the paint and my brushes to get the kinds of marks that I want, it's much easier to simply hold on to that feeling and carry it from my master study into the original pet portrait that I'm composing, if it's still in muscle memory like that, that is. That being said, this translation may not happen easily right out the gate. In helping hundreds of artists find and master their unique, expressive style of oil painting, I've learned that repetition is key here. Sometimes the first time you do this exercise, where you warm up with a master copy and then switch gears to work off of your own reference photograph, you get really loose in the master copy, since after all, the master painting is showing you exactly how to avoid things like tightening up, or how to have exactly the color that you want to incorporate. But then you go right back to old habits when you just have a reference photo in front of you with no additional guide. And that's completely normal. What I've observed is that this gets markedly better with repetition, which is why I think it's important to take the pressure off of suddenly being able to leap forward in your style or your skill level with just one painting. Again, if your client loved your previous pet portraits, you should be able to rest assured that they'll like their pet portrait. That being said, if you have been successfully loosening up your work over time, it's probably necessary to remove older, tighter portraits from your portfolio so that you make it clear to your clients exactly what they're going to be getting. Now, with these 3 huge steps out of the way, here are some additional helpful tidbits that I've picked up on my own pet portrait painting journey. If your goal is to paint loosely, don't worry about individual strands of fur. Chances are, if you put together an inspiration board of the kinds of pet portraits that you aspire to paint, those artists and those paintings don't get sucked into small detail like individual strands of fur. At least this is probably true if you're watching my channel, where I focus on loose painting. Let that give you permission, instead, to study how value and color describe the overall form of the animal versus stressing over the idea of fine textures to make it realistic. Instead of texture, though, I would think about being mindful of your edges. When we think about crisp edges in paintings, 2 key predictors of when we need to soften our edges come from form and from texture. Objects that gently slope away from us can typically be represented by softened edges. Same thing goes for textures like fur, hair, and feathers. So instead of creating crisp individual edges for each strand of hair in an animal's coat, like I mentioned above, consider creating one large soft edge for that passage instead. It will evoke the idea of fur more effectively and with much less painstaking detail. Next, if the animal is white or has a lot of white in their coat, don't confuse that as needing a bunch of pure white paint. So many colors bounce into a white animal's coat. Take Pillsbury here. He has a creamy tint to his mane, a slate gray muzzle, reflections of the grassy pasture below him in his neck that makes it green, and then this haze of blue coming in from the sky above. In putting aside the color, to make white accents pop, you need to make other areas darker in value anyway, so make sure you aren't just reaching for white straight out of the tube. Finally, don't stress out too much if your pet portrait commission is slow going or getting overly tight. I find it's really natural with commissions for artists to paint tighter than they have been, or for the painting to take a particularly long time. That's normal. To remedy this, I would first go back to my comment about how clients come to you because they like your existing portfolio of work. That means that if you've been painting loosely, you don't need to be afraid to paint loosely in the pet portrait. But sometimes it's not as simple as just giving yourself permission to loosen up. And I know that from my own commission experience. A lot of paintings you've seen me make on this channel have been commissioned pieces And by now, while I certainly haven't seen it all, I've seen a lot. Oftentimes, the concern here is that while in original pieces, you have some freedom to lose your model's likeness a little bit, because after all, the piece hasn't been commissioned to look like a particular person, and your collector probably doesn't know if the model's eyes don't quite look like the way you've painted them. On commissioned work, you can't get away with that. The result is that we often worry so much about the likeness that the only way, it seems, to guarantee that we'll nail the likeness is to paint tight. A short-term solution for this is that if you're running into likeness issues, to use a foolproof method to ensure that your drawing, that is, the placement of shapes and the proportion of those shapes on your canvas, is accurate. There are so many tools that you can use for this, but the two that I recommend the most are these. First, when possible, set up your reference and your painting right next to one another on your easel. So they're the same size and they're perfectly lined up next to one another. You'll probably need to run to Walgreens or to a print shop to get an accurate photo print of your reference to do this, like I did for the Sargent master copy. Then make sure your canvas is the same size as the reference, and you intend to place your subject on the canvas in the same way. If you don't, before you print off your reference, you'll want to have worked this out until they really do match up 100%. Once they're all set, so they're the same composition, the same size, they're lined up right next to one another, your job is so much easier. To check for the most glaring drawing errors, as well as issues with value and often color too, all you need to do from here is to back up a good 10 feet and squint at the side-by-side images, like one of those spot the difference games that you used to see in kids' magazines. Most of my students tell me that they struggle to see issues in proportion until they upload an image of their reference side by side with their painting for me to review them. And then suddenly, it's night and day to them. The simplest way to avoid this frustrating epiphany is to simply back up often, and don't be afraid to take breaks to rest and reset your eye when you need to. But what if you really, really just want to make it as simple as possible? Then I like using this Photoshop trick. I'll link the video above where I show you exactly how to do it step by step, but essentially you will digitally superimpose your painting over your reference, lining everything up. And then you lower the opacity on your painting until you can clearly see both the painting and the reference at once. And it's going to be 100% clear what's lining up and what isn't. As a bonus, you can also use Photoshop to test out where you can get away with softening certain edges and losing some information, which can act as a visual guide showing you exactly where you can afford to get loose without it looking sloppy. And there you have it, my top tips for painterly pet portraits. If you love the look of my portraits, whether human or animal, and you want to learn how to master this for yourself, all you need to do is click the link in the description to tell me more about yourself and to find a time to talk with me one-on-one. Or you can simply comment painting goals in the comments and I will reply with a link there to get you started. I look forward to hearing all about your goals and the painterly pet portraits you want to make. Until then, happy painting.